folks that are already very familiar with open source programs offices and what they do, I'm hoping to challenge a little bit of your thinking on how you approach them, how you build them, how you structure them. For those who have no idea, I'm going to go very high level and give sort of a basic background on what they are and how they work. As you said, my name is Duane O'Brien. I work at Capital One. If you're in Europe and don't know who Capital One is, they're a top 10 bank in the US. They're a major credit card issuer. I lead an organization at Capital One called Collaborative Engineering, which includes the Inner Source Programs Office and the Open Source Programs Office and a couple of other things. I have been building and leading or advising open source programs offices for about 10 years now. And I spend a lot of time thinking about open source sustainability and how projects, in particular, how projects can connect to funding and otherwise keep their projects going. I also serve on the board of an organization called the Open Source Collective Foundation that serves as the fiscal host for a lot of projects that are maintainer run, giving them a way to receive funds and transparently distribute them throughout their own organization. Now, I have some opinions that I'll express through here. If you get mad about something that I say, that's on me. It's not on Capital One, although I'm grateful that they paid my way to come here and to talk today. So if you've heard OSPO, it's just Open Source Programs Office. And sometimes there's a debate, is it Open Source Program Office or Programs Office? I encourage Programs Office because I want people to think about more than just a single program for engaging with the open source community. I'll go back and forth between the two as I go through the talk today. So if you haven't heard the term OSPO, every time you hear OSPO, Open Source Program Office. As far as what one is, I get about a half of a sentence through this and my attention span just peters out. And I can't go through and read a whole definition, but if you do some Googling, you'll see a lot of common terms come up. They're a center of competency for an organization and a whole bunch of things. Then this is like 4 sentences, but an entire paragraph in the middle of what they could do. If you go on and looking, you can find shorter definitions. And again, center of competency. I like to think about it much more simply. An OSPO is where you send people when they need open source help. That's it. Whether those people are coming in from outside your organization or whether those people are coming from inside your organization, you need a place to send people when they need help. Now, the reason I asked the question around academia versus government versus private industry is the word office contains different connotations. It's different if I say I have an office of open source at the UN than if I say I have an office of open source at this company that has 250 people, right? But if we think about it through the lens of you need a place to send people when they get help, as opposed to, we're going to send people to Gwen. Do you know Gwen? If you don't know Gwen, she's the person wandering around, like ask them for help. Like if you don't know how to find Gwen, you're not going to find Gwen to get help from questions. So you need a place that you can send people when they need help. Now, open source programs offices have largely been adopted across the industry, but if you look at a lot of these, some of these are very big companies, and I know that there's a lot of small to medium enterprise, small to medium business in Ireland that needs to be served as well. Not just big companies, but a lot of companies. Some of these OSPOs don't exist anymore, or there are people who have adopted them in the past. This comes out of a group called the To-Do Group. They've also been adopted across academia. There are a number of universities and institutions that have taken and built their own open source programs office, a place that people can go when they need open source help. We also see them showing up in government. We know the EC has one, and we know that there are some in other government institutions. And the proliferation of open source programs offices kicked into high gear starting around 2014 when the To-Do Group sort of made this announcement. And it was described to me informally by some of the early members as it was sort of their informal peer therapy group, right? They all were running an open source programs office in their own organization. They didn't have anybody to talk to. They would go to conferences and they would sit at the bar and they would say, oh, we're dealing with this problem. Oh, that sounds super familiar. I'm sorry you're having that problem. And they would also troubleshoot, and they found there was a lot of learning that they were doing from each other. And in particular, as was mentioned from the stage earlier today, they found that they were sort of a high-speed connection into each other's organizations if they needed to talk about open source problems. So they got together, they launched the To-Do Group. But we know that term, Open Source Programs Office, is older than this. And I went digging to see if I could find reference to one of the earlier ones. We see in the top right corner the Sun Open Source Program Office. And if you look way up at the top there, back from June 2002, right? So Sometimes there gets to be debate like when was the first open source program office? I don't think that question matters, but we know programs offices have been around since longer than just the to-do groups launched in 2014. So what does an OSPO do? The to-do group does now have a large body of knowledge, largely serving the private industry, because that's where a lot of those players came from. One of the things that they have put together is called the OSPO mind map. And even if you're sitting in the front, this might be hard to read. But you go through and you look at there's different roles, all kinds of things that your OSPO could do, or different behaviors or size. But if you start clicking through this isn't even the whole chart. And I don't know about you, but I start to get vertigo when I try to dig down through all the things that the OSPO could do. And sometimes it can be overwhelming, because if you listen to people who talk about their open source programs offices, we will get lost in the just like the large sea of things that we're told we have to do. You must care about compliance. Oh, you have to have a community engagement program. Are you a member of these foundations? Because if you're not a member of these foundations, you really need to be. Do you have policies written down? Do you have tooling written down? And we haven't even hired a person or talked about it or even figured out who the person is going to report to. So I want to pull back out of that huge diagram here, and I want to get much more simple. I think there's really only two reasons that you should start an open source programs office. You have an open source problem to solve, or you see an open source opportunity. And if you start from one of those two perspectives, and I really want to encourage you to grab one and hold on to it, or else you find yourself trying to hold a dozen reasons that you're starting one, then I think some things start to clarify. So let's talk about you have an open source problem to solve. Maybe your organization doesn't know how to use open source very well and you want to get better at it. Or you find yourself dependent on these open source projects that are built and maintained by a community and you need help from them, but you can't get there, right? Or you have developers coming to you all the time and saying, I want to make open source contributions. Am I allowed to do that? And no one knows the answer. Or you have someone from the board or someone from your leadership team tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, this log4j thing, are we using it? And no one knows how to answer that question, right? You don't have an intake process. There's people who are coming to your university, who are coming to your places of business, or you're reaching out to you at events and saying, are you thinking about open sourcing this, or how do I get access to open data, or otherwise have open source questions, and there's nobody to take those questions. You don't know who it is, and you can't wander around and try to find the right person in the company. So you want to create a centralized location where people can come and take in those requests, right? Also, you might just decide you want to release some source code, but no one knows how to do it, right? And so you have to build some structure around how you might do that. So you might have an open source problem to solve. You might also see an open source opportunity. You've developed something really innovative, and you want it to go faster, right? And you think that you can help it go faster by engaging with the global community and the global mind share around open source to help build it out. You have an existing culture in your organization, and you think bringing more openness to that culture can transform how you work. Like that might be another opportunity that you're taking of. You could try to disrupt a competitor, right? If you're looking for a good example of this is Android, right? Apple and iOS hit the market and they were suddenly taking off in dominance. And what was Google's counter move? An open source mobile operating system that now is much, much larger in terms of footprint. You might be looking to try to build a strong reputation. You might be looking to improve your ability to hire. So you're trying to take things, you don't have a problem you're trying to solve, but you see an opportunity that you want to take advantage of. Get a drink of water, pardon me. I lost my voice like 3 weeks ago, and I'm super happy to be able to be here. When you think through this lens, right, it's a place to go, it's a place for people to go when they have questions that need to get answered, or the place to get open source help. And are you trying to solve a problem, or are you trying to take advantage of an opportunity? I think the way you build and structure your open source program office starts to make a lot of sense. When I talk to people who want to start one for the first time, where do I put it? How many people do I hire? How big should it be? What should my budget be? All of these other questions. And when you lead with that question, my typical first response is, what are you trying to do? Right? Are you trying to take advantage of an opportunity? Are you trying to solve a problem? Why are you starting an OSPO? Because if you are trying to start an OSPO because you heard a bunch of people were starting an OSPOs and it sounds like a good idea, you're not going to find success, right? Because you don't know what you're looking for. So I think these questions can be clarifying and answering a lot of those follow-on questions. Where do you put it? And that'll come into sort of the last point I want to make, but I left a lot of time at the end for Q&A to talk about different facets of open source programs offices. But once you get to this point, I really think you only need about 3 things for your open source programs office. And again, they're conceptual, they're a little bit more high level. The first one is authority. If you're trying to solve a problem or take advantage of an opportunity, does your open source program office have the authority they need to do that? Now, I'll give a couple of examples. If you need someone in your organization to own the policy that says, here's who's allowed to contribute or how you're allowed to contribute or consume open source software, if they don't have the ability to enforce that policy, given where you put them in the organization, they can't succeed, right? And I think about this often when I'm talking to tech companies who are trying to build their first open source programs office. They say, well, what level person should I be, or how should we think about hiring? I always say you should have at least a director level authority, because that's the very beginning of where you start to get the authority that you can say you have to do it because the guy has a certain level of authority in the organization. So if you don't, think about the authority that your program office needs in order to take advantage of your opportunity or to solve your problem. The second is sponsorship. Do you have the right level of executive sponsorship that they can continue to defend the budget for the program office, to socialize the need of the program office with the other lines of business, with the other heads within your organization? Do you have executive leaders who are going to advocate for your work with their peers? If you don't, it will be challenging to continue to defend the existence of your open source programs office. Where I experienced this personally, at my role prior to Capital One, I worked at a large organization called Indeed. They've got a large office here in Dublin. And I was hired by executive sponsors who had certain design goals in what they wanted to put together for their open source programs office. When those executive leaders left, I didn't have the same kind of sponsorship for the program office. We had to change our approach and what we were doing with that organization. So one of the things that I hear people talk about when they're building a program office is there's a generalized understanding that would be a good idea. There are some passionate open source people in the organization who want to start one, and they're trying to figure out how to get it off the ground from a grassroots perspective, but they don't have an executive leader who can sponsor them yet. And that's always a struggle. So if you're thinking about starting one, authority and sponsorship are the first 2. The third is willingness. Do you have someone there who wants to do it in the first place? Now, you might have expected to see ability here. I don't think ability is the thing that keeps it from being successful. You can hire ability, you can train ability, right? But if you don't have anybody who wants to do it, they're not going to be successful. And the reason I wanted to put willingness here is because all of us who run open source program offices today had no idea what we were doing with them at some point. Right? We were all starting off from scratch with an open source programs office. This community of leaders of open source programs offices is one of the most generous, kind, self-supporting communities I've ever been around. I see several of them in the room. I'm going to point at Wolfgang back in the back here just to call him out by name. What? When you connect with another leader in an OSPO, they will tell you what they're working on, tell you how they got to where they got, give you advice on your policies, give you advice on how to hire. There was a joke for a while, back maybe 10 years ago, that there were so few people who were working in open source program offices that if you hired someone, you had to buy someone else a case of beer because you probably hired them away from a friend, right? And so if you want to get one off the ground and you have someone who wants to do the work but doesn't know how to do the work yet, there's a huge network of peer support that you can plug them into to get the support. And that's why I think willingness is far more important than ability here, because you can teach ability, you can learn ability, you can hire ability. You can't do that with willingness, right? I know that was a little high level, especially I didn't expect to see quite so many hands go up when everyone said, I have more than a vague idea of what open source programs offices are. And I also know I'm standing between you and lunch. So I want to stop and I want to open for discussion or questions. Those of you who stayed in the room to hear an overview of open source programs offices, what do you want to know more about, or what challenges are you facing, or what opportunities are you hoping to take advantage of?
One question, like, how does it look for different size companies? Because sometimes when I talk about this with friends, like, they have a small company making sure you don't have resources, and at what point do you think it makes sense to have like a FTE, like actual one person committed to this full time, and how does it look?
It's a great question, and I'll repeat it for the camera because I don't know what carries through. The question was, how does this look at different size companies? And I'm so glad you asked that question because I was looking at the data just before I came up. In 2021, the To-Do Group did a survey about the state of open source program offices, and they asked about the size of open source programs offices relative to the size of companies. And it was interesting. They talked about the size range of companies, and they talked about the size of the OSPO, but they didn't tie the two together in that. But something like 40% of them had 10 or more people, right? And so if your company's 250 people, that's a huge piece of your company, right? Only about 7% of them were just one person. I think anecdotally, when I talk to different other organizations, I think if you've got 3 people in an OSPO, that's pretty good, right? When I was at Indeed, I had 8 people. At Capital One, I've got 13 people in the whole collaborative engineering organization, but they have thousands of developers, right? What do you do if you have 250 people? It might just be one person, and it might be only half of their responsibilities, right? I think, how do I want to say this? One of the most important things that you can do is give them the title and give them the authority. And sometimes I call it anointing them, right? Like you're making it clear, not just to the external community, but to your internal community, this is our person for open source, like even if it's only half of their responsibility, so that everyone knows how to go to them, how to find them, and then get them out into the community and plug them in. So I guess the other thing I would say is that the answer to that really depends on the size of the opportunity, the size of the problem that you're solving. There were a couple of different conversations about SBOMs and composition tools and kind of understanding what software you're running. If that is a super important question for your organization, even if it's small, you might want to put a couple people on it. What else?
It's a tough state.
That's all right.
Why do you think there are the governments behind on adopting the OSPOs, and what do you think can be done to encourage more OSPOs in government space?
We were talking about that second question yesterday, so I thank you for the queue up there. Why do I think governments have been slower to adopt OSPOs in the private industry, and what do I think we could do to help more governments adopt that approach? I think it's just slower to adopt technology in general and technological practices, and we've seen that kind of cut across a whole bunch of different aspects of how governments move. There are a number of open source programs offices in governments, and I think if we believe in that as a practice, if we believe it's a successful model that we want to see our government institutions, large and small, adopt, the best thing we can do is help the ones who are already in existence be wildly successful and demonstrate that they can deliver not just savings and efficiencies, but also openness and access, so that we're sort of appealing to a broad group of people. Yeah, I think that's how I want to take that one. So, what else? Go ahead.
So we're one of the government agencies, so it's the main thing that concerns us is security.
Mm-hmm.
Systems, security, data, and all of this. You see, when it comes to, it's a national asset, and we have to be very mindful of that.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you sell that? Sell an OSPO, given security concerns
Mm-hmm.
within government? Obviously, sentinel programmers and
Sure. So the question, and I'm going to super shorthand your question because I just got the time up as poster. With security being such a concern, especially in the government space, how do you sell openness and the OSPO in light of that? There's a couple things I would say there. One, if the Army and the Air Force, the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, if they can embrace open source and if they can engage in it effectively, any one of us can, right? Obviously, we talked a little bit about the transparency and the trust that we can bring to code when you can see it and understand it, so there's that facet to it. But also there is so much that we have identified over the last few years for potential security concerns that might come up with open source. We've seen a lot of OSPOs shift their footing away from how can we give back and engage to the community to how can we more effectively manage our software artifacts and so on. So building up the knowledge in-house for how these technologies work is the best first step to understanding how to secure them. If you don't have anybody in your organization who understands how they work and understands how these ecosystems fit together, you're relying on someone else to secure them for you, and that just pushes the problem outside. So with that, again, I got the time is up poster. Thank you so much for coming. I'm around all day if you want to talk further. So.